Welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast rated PG for crude humor, outrageous hijinks, and mild language. I'm Max.
I'm Jasper.
I'm Jared.
I'm Nelson.
And today we're discussing our random slime shuffle from last week, 1993's Airborne.
Let me tell you what styling is. The perfect session, A-frame wave, ground swell, spitting out salt water in your face, doing a 360 without a bounce. I call it the consciousness razor.
Mitchell's life was a California dream. Until he woke up in Cincinnati.
Oh, see you in school.
Now, he has one chance to prove himself. One final race to win. And he's the one who has what it takes to put them over the top. Airborne.
I think I'm starting to like Cincinnati.
Airborne follows surfer dude Mitchell as he is sent from sunny California to live with his aunt and uncle in dreary landlocked Cincinnati, Ohio. And there he must use his rollerblading skill to defeat his bullies, win some hockey, and win the girl of his dreams.
The film was directed by Rob Bauman, who isn't much of a Slimehouse director. This was his first feature, though. He went on to do Reign of Fire, Elektra, and the first X-Files movie. It was produced by Icon Studios, Mel Gibson's production company. And the only notable crew is Stuart Copeland, the drummer from The Police, did the music, and he would go on to do other slime-related music, including the soundtrack to Good Burger. The cast is really fascinating. The lead actor, Mitchell, is played by Shane McDermott, who was a soap star on the soap opera All My Children, and this was his only feature film role. He went out on top. But additionally, it has some young actors who went on to become pretty big comedy stars. Seth Green plays Wiley, Mitchell's cousin, and Jack Black plays Augie, one of the many bullies in the movie. And another recognizable face worth mentioning is Edie McClurg, who is a woman also in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Flubber, Master of Disguise, a great character actress who shows up in a lot of silly roles, and she here is in perfect form as Aunt Irene.
So this is our first random shuffle ever. It was of the 737 movies we could have chosen, we landed on this one. So thank you, RNG. And I think Jasper added this, and I have to ask, because I know he watched Elektra recently. Is this because of that?
Yes, I think it actually is. I can't specifically say so, but I watched Elektra, which is the sequel to Daredevil. I watched both of those recently. So I looked up Rob Bowman, and I immediately saw this on his filmography. I was like, what is this? And it kind of reminded me of, I kind of assumed it was like a straight to DVD or, a TV movie from this era. But as I, looked a little deeper, it was a, full on theatrical release. And the 1993 date was really interesting to me because it felt like one of the earlier kind of extreme sports movies that I had heard of from this era. Like it felt like it kind of hit the wave, no pun intended, right as it was kind of starting to crest. So I immediately threw it on the watch list. It was definitely a late addition to our extensive watch list, but I'm very stoked that it came up as our first pick here on our Slime Shuffle feature.
Yeah, let's get pitted.
Yeah, I have to say, I think one thing that's really cool about it being our first random shuffle, A, none of us had seen it, and B, we have yet to tap into the extreme sports genre, and this has no shortage of it. You've got surfing, hockey, rollerblading, roller hockey, and roller racing, all kind of one after another, throughout the movie. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I was very happy to have landed on this movie because I think this wasn't the only one that none of us had seen. It's one that wasn't really on our radar, even having heard of it, other than Jasper saying it shared the director with Elektra. So a very pleasant surprise because it's a very fun movie and very slimy movie and really taps into something that we hadn't seen. Because not only have we not really done the extreme sports movies, we haven't really tackled sports movies at all outside of a few of the animal sports movies like Snow Dolls, which are kind of their own subgenre. So it was interesting to finally get to our first sports movie, because I think that's a pretty crucial subgenre within slime, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. I think that was a big trend slime was jumping on.
We talked about this a little bit in Max Keeble's Big Move, because there's like there's sort of reverence for extreme sports that we saw in that movie, and I think one thing that we talked about is like the juxtaposition of that versus like how like football was like the more kind of like normal kid kind of sport, whereas like skateboarding and these kind of more extreme sports that were more about like individuality were like what were glorified in these kinds of movies. And I especially felt that watching this. Like, I mean, there's like what everyone else, because like as we mentioned, the plot is about a Californian kid moving to Ohio, where everyone's into hockey and, you know, cold sports. And hockey, I think, is framed in this movie as like what everyone else is into, but this Mitchell kid, he's into surfing and he finds an affinity for rollerblading and what have you. But I think that was something that like we mentioned a couple weeks ago during the Max Keeble discussion, that I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but I especially feel like that's a trope now, like the sports that the lame kids are into versus like the sports that the cool kids are into.
Yeah, and this makes it pretty explicit, because he's like bullied blatantly just for being a surfer. They regard, like in this movie, a lot of the bullies regard surfer as an insult all its own. They'll like kind of taunt him, being like, "Hey surfer boy, hey surfer," like, and just and then at some point they tell him surfing isn't a real sport like hockey and stuff. It's just, of the many things he's bullied for in this movie, the main one seems to be his affinity for surfing, which really shows that like that's the cool alternative sport, and these kids are all playing the lame sports, not the cool kid stuff.
Which kind of parallels, I don't know if you guys recall, in Hocus Pocus, which we looked at in October, a similar story of middle school, high schooler moving from California to the other side of the country. He also gets called out for being like a California surfer kid in the opening scene we meet him in the classroom. Also same year, so definitely feels like something was in the air against us Southern California kids back in the day.
Another thing is that like this is at least the second movie, probably not even, that like where it's set in like kind of like suburban Ohio area. I'm thinking of House Arrest, that's also set somewhere in Ohio. There's probably another movie we've talked about that I'm blanking on that also might be set there, but I feel like this particular region is like, I think it's kind of like, it's like shorthand for Midwest, like middle America, kind of like just like
Every Town USA kind of thing.
Yeah, Every Town USA, yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, and one thing I will say about this movie is, despite that, I was surprised by like how distinctly Cincinnati this movie felt, because I didn't grow up in Cincinnati, obviously, but that's the closest like major city to Lexington so I spent a lot of time there. That was like a go-to day trip, and I actually recognized like more locations in this than I did in the Lexington shot movie Dreamer that we watched earlier. This like all this stuff, I was just like, oh, I've seen that spot in Cincinnati. In particular, there's a botanical garden in one scene, a pretty prominent scene that I've spent a lot of time at, and it's like they really capture a lot of like Cincinnati landmarks in a way that I wasn't expecting, like because you don't really think of, like, you think of like New York movies, LA movies, you don't really think of any Cincinnati movies, but this and Todd Haynes' Dark Water, both very Cincinnati films.
Yeah, I have to give a big shout out to my my good friend Adam Lawrence, who is a Cincinnati-based filmmaker, and I went out there to shoot Designated Survivor Season 3's documentary components because we needed to find a place where there were swing voters. And we went to the stadium that's featured around the climax of the movie is the exact stadium where we shot a lot of interviews. So I also felt like, even though I haven't spent as much time in Cincinnati, I also felt like it was a very good depiction of that particular city, which isn't often covered.
Yeah, I saw Bob Seger at that arena when I was younger, which I feel like is a very crucially Midwest experience there.
I want to bridge a few different of our ideas we've brought up so far. One with the moving transplant trope that seems to be really common, where it's kind of the new kid in town and he's an outsider and all that. It's a great kind of fish out of water premise, and it allows for that culture clash that's kind of fun. And I get the feeling, because all these movies are most often LA productions, I get the feeling there's almost this like cultural infusion of like the California spirit into these other places, and that's kind of what they're pushing. Because when you meet Mitchell, he's very zen, he's very cool, he's not a conformist. He's not into the team sports. He's really into the extreme solo sports that are more about like your personality vibes and all that. And I kind of see this like, you could almost write like a more academic thing about how there's this like approach of like the Californiization of the rest of the country that we kind of see through these characters that get transplanted to these Midwest cities.
Yeah, and Hocus Pocus definitely rings in that too, because not only are these like, they happen to be from California, they make these characters like very California kids, like the most like stereotype California, like chill bra kind of guy. He's always saying chill bra in this movie.
Yeah, my favorite quote, which as a California kid, I have not heard this one before, but when he says, "Yeah, it's a conscious razor," was one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah, I just loved his whole like Bodhi from Point Break like style, like philosophizing in this. Just was very funny to me.
The perfect session. A-frame wave, ground swell, spitting out salt water in your face, doing a little lip action move, a 360 without a bounce. I call it a liquid Drano. Wanna be Bullwinkle. I tell you no lie, my friends. It's a consciousness razor.
Oh, man, I'm gonna throw up.
Okay, I'm so glad you brought up Point Break, because to me, this movie reminded me so much of two Macho Man movies, Point Break and Top Gun. And it kind of feels like they took those conventions in terms of Outsider and the trials and tribulations they were going on, and they were like, let's PGize that trope or whatever. And it kind of goes to Jasper's point before about how you never watch movies about kids your own age. You watch movies a little bit older. And so it's a high school movie through and through, but it feels like the type of movie I'd watch in middle school and be like, sick, you know? And so it kind of feels like they took a lot of the conventions of like very masculine adult movies, but then PGized it and still kept like that sports feeling.
Kind of two notes to bounce off that. First, it reminded me of like a Point Break, Top Gun. I love that you bring that up, Nelson. But it also kind of reminded me of like a Slimehouse extreme movie, John Hughes movie in a weird way. Something like The Breakfast Club or Pretty in Pink, but you know, with rollerblades in it. Just the kind of the way it's shot, the tone of it. It's light on its feet, but it also has some like weight to the relationships. It's not totally balls to the wall with its humor. In fact, there's not a ton of humor in this movie. So in that way, it kind of reminded me of, you know, the classic Hughes style. And then another thing that kind of inched me in that direction is that, and this kind of goes to the more Top Gun Point Break note, is the way it captures rollerblading is less, to me, kind of extreme and almost more elegant, especially in the opening scene when they're still in California and he's kind of skating against the sunset and there's these just beautiful wide shots with rollerbladers silhouetted. It felt very dreamlike, very relaxing in a weird way, and not so extreme in the way that a lot of these sports would become very soon after this. So it almost felt like a love letter to rollerblading in a weird way. And then in that way, I kind of really liked it. And maybe it docked it down on the slime meter a little bit, but it still, yeah, it almost felt like elevated in a weird way.
Yeah, there was one scene in particular I like noted, like, wow, this is like a good, like a beautiful shot. This makes rollerblading look so beautiful when like they're coming over a hill at one point. I think it's during like the big race at the end, and they're all coming over this hill, and they very much are focusing on like them lifting up over this, like you see them against the sky, that I thought was a really interesting, cool shot that was like very pretty. And yeah, the movie like definitely didn't, it seemed more like they weren't just being like, oh, roller like blading, that's a trend. It seemed like whoever wrote this movie or made this movie had some kind of affinity for rollerblading and wasn't just using it as the extreme sport of the moment, because they really did shoot the rollerblading scenes much more both like beautifully and like thrillingly in the race scene than I expected. Because that race scene was like pretty intense, like an exciting scene, I thought, at least to me.
Sure.
Yeah.
And real stunts, you could tell. Like there were times where I was like, holy shit, just
Yeah.
throughout. It was just crazy stuff that my mom wouldn't let me do. So.
One thing I would say about the experience of watching this is that it reminded me a lot of the documentary we looked at last season and interviewed the creators of, called The Orange Years. And like the shows like Dude Ranch and maybe Pete and Pete somewhat, but like it had that kind of look and feel to it that those shows they kind of highlighted did. And yeah, I think it's just that kind of like early 90s, early slime kind of aesthetic.
One note that as I was watching this, I kind of devised a new personal line on my own Slimehouse rubric, and it, speaking to your point on the Orange Years about, the beginning of Nickelodeon, is would this movie feel at home on Nickelodeon as a TV movie? And to me, it kind of across the board, if that kind of ethos rings true in a specific movie, then to me it kind of puts it in the Slimehouse realm. And exactly what you're saying, Jared, this definitely feels like one of those earlier ones before the comedy got a little zanier, before the colors got a little brighter. It's definitely kids doing kid stuff the way kids want to see kids doing kid stuff.
And one movie that like I think of in terms of like the extreme sports subgenre, 10 years later, I remember this movie coming out called Grind.
Yeah.
Y'all heard of that? So like that, I'll admit I've never seen it, but from what I know of it and the commercials I would see for it, it does not seem very Slimehouse to me. It seems like kind of like older than Slimehouse. And I think I just like between the 10 years of when this came out and then when Grind came out, just the evolution of these particular kind of extreme sports is really fascinating. How it started as this kind of like something in tandem with early Slime, then as in 2003 as Slimehouse is kind of entering sort of like the past the peak moment. The extreme sports they're still popular, but I think they're kind of thought of as like more than just a slime thing. They're more mainstream.
Yeah, there seemed to be such a big push to kind of get kids into this stuff. I mean, this is also peak time for ski movies, like the early 90s. But then I also think about Rocket Power, which has a lot of similarities to this, where it's funny, but it's not a comedy. Like, they're not gag-based things, but the characters are kind of funny, but they take themselves seriously, and that's some of the humor. And to your point earlier, Jasper, this movie does play it straight, and it's funny because it's funny in the way like Dazed and Confused is funny, where it's a high school hangout movie, not as much of like silly situations.
Yeah, for sure. Because like I was noting a lot of as I was like noting tropes as I watched this. There's like so many like sort of narrative and character tropes, but there aren't any sort of the comedic, not many at least, of the comedic and visual tropes at all of Slimehouse, which I think gives it much more of an air of like a more adult movie toned down for a kid audience than a movie that was like just to exploit the extreme sports trend for just like a stupid comedy movie.
At first I thought there were going to be more of these because the beginning is totally silly, where like the parents are like, we're moving to Australia and we're sending you to Cincinnati, and he's like, oh man. And it has a very Snow Dogs feel too, like he has the perfect life on the beach, jump to a shitty cold place essentially, and then he has the goofy aunt and uncle.
Yeah, the aunt and uncle were very slimy. When they showed up, I thought this was going to be like a super Slimehouse movie.
Yeah, so that was misleading. And then once you get into the sports, and it has a little bit of like identity crisis of which sports it wants to be mostly about. But once you get into that, it's much more like high school or whatever, and less about the gags. But yeah, the great setup to the whole thing.
Funny you say that about its kind of sports identity crisis, because that's something I kind of liked about this movie, is that when we were growing up, there was a lot of kids who did a lot of different sports. Like, I don't necessarily know a kid who was just a skateboarder or just a baseball player. I mean, there were, yes, but like I loved rollerblading and I loved going on my bike and I loved playing soccer. You know, I had friends who were star baseball players, but also, you know, could rip an ollie like nobody else. And so I liked that this movie was not just about rollerblading or just about surfing. It had the hockey element in there too. And it kind of made it feel a little bit more authentic. Not that this movie was going for authenticity per se, but it gave it a lot more heart and kind of realism in a way that one hits kind of the nostalgia nerve. You know, it really genuinely made me feel nostalgic for a time long past now, but it also kind of it helped to encapsulate a lot of different attitudes of this era as opposed to just kind of inflating one. And bouncing off that too, I think one of the key things that we always talk about is kind of the anti-authoritarian bend in a lot of these movies. And in this, it's definitely there, but I think it manifests in something a little bit more of an individualistic theme.
It's a movie about not losing your identity, but also kind of like allowing yourself to enjoy new experiences and not be like shut off towards it. I feel like it's just very baked into the premise of the film and the character of Mitchell. And, you know, he's like, I feel like as far as Slimehouse protagonists go, I think he's not as much of like an every kid as like what you would see in something like Snow Day or Keeble. I think he's framed as like being this like, well, yes, a fish out of water, but also like I think there's a lot of like scenes of how like his female classmates are especially interested in him that you don't really get in like other movies that we look at. And like he's just like, he has this vibe to him that's so like proto McConaughey and Dazed and Confused almost. Just like this almost
he's a stud.
Almost like, you know, so laid back that it's almost like, you know, it's almost like a meme. But...
Yeah, it's funny. That's funny. He reminded me of like every 15, 16-year-old on TikTok nowadays, down to the hair, down to the haircut, down to the haircut, down to the tie-dye t-shirts. Although that dolphin tie-dye t-shirt that he was wearing at the end was so sick. Hoping I could find that on Depop or something.
Yeah, it's interesting that this movie, like, even though he's the fish out of water, he's never presented as like a nerd or lame at all. If anything, his bullies are presented as like lame slackers still, even though they're the ones bullying him. And he's like the cool hunk in the school. Like, all the girls like him. There's a scene where like a girl looks at him and fantasizes about him with like his shirt off with sunglasses on, and he gives like a double thumbs up, which I really thought was funny. Like, he's very much presented, even though he's the fish out of water being bullied, he's not lame at all. He's like the cool hunk in the school. Like, the bullies just don't like him. Like, this one gang of bullies just hate him.
And like the bullies in this are not like, I don't feel like they're the conventional Slimehouse bullies where they're just like caricatures. I feel like there is like a, you know, it's like what Max is saying. I feel like this character and those characters they're almost on the same level, like in terms of like social power, I feel. And that's like, I feel like it's just more like teammates on the hockey team or on the sports team not getting along almost, more than just like the conventional like Max Keeble versus Troy McGinty.
Yeah, they're very much presented as classmates of the same age, but as a result, there are so many bullies in this posse. I think there are two kind of main like bad guys, Blaine and Walt, who are like blonde-haired, like big guys or whatever, and they're just irredeemable, full-scale bullies. But then you have this middle ground of like the bullies who then go on to like get along with them, and you've got Snake, who's a fun like one-liner character, and then Augie, who's Jack Black, who gets a lot of fun like slacker dude lines. And the one who's given the most dimension is this guy Jack, who is the main one trying to say like, you got to play hockey, man. You know, like he looks very like square, like would fit on the cover of Boys Life magazine or something like that.
He reminded me of like a beefed up Matthew Broderick. Like, if Matthew Broderick took steroids, he would look like Jack.
Because he had that very just like golden boy look.
He's like
his
he'd be
face.
A model for like a hockey magazine or something like that, and then he ends up being the brother of Mitchell's girl, and so that creates another familiar dynamic of like, don't mess with my sister kind of thing. And so there are all these bullies, and it's funny because it's not as gag based as the other ones we stuffed, but there is a big like montage where after Mitchell makes like the dumbest mistake he can make with the hockey game, they like fill his locker with sand and they make his cousin Wiley's locker sticky. And
There's some. I mean, there's
stuff.
literal slime in this movie. In that scene.
In that,
They threw that scene in there just to give us throw us a bone 30 years later almost.
And then he does get his revenge. He at a certain point, Blaine is being a dick to him while they're playing hockey, and he comes up behind him and pantses him, which is like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, pantsing is like a very Slimehouse. I think a lot of the bullying and stuff in this was very slimy to me. Like the pantsing, there's some like swirlies, which I feel like are stuff you see so much in like 90s kid stuff, or bullies giving swirlies, sticking somebody's head in the toilet. And I think that, it's the main bully, Jack, was a pretty just like, but I think the most interesting bully here, for me at least, was Augie, as we mentioned, Jack Black's character, because he was kind of an interesting, when he first was introduced, like I was like, okay, so he's a bully. Then he introduces himself to the class, and he says a funny line where he says his hobbies are like sleep and Nintendo, and then he can't think of anything else, which Nintendo, a slimy console for sure. You never hear people talking about Dreamcasts or anything in these Slimehouse movies, or Genesis. So. But yeah, this kid is, I thought, so it's like, he's kind of this mix of this like lame slacker, but also a bully, because he has a lot of the best insults in the movie too. He says he was been mixing Drano with his what was the line again? Mixing Drano with. Oh, yeah.
I think that pretty boy Maharashi over here has been mixing a little Drano with his fruit punch.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, I loved that. And he also has some good like dumb guy moments where he's told to chill out, brah, and he thinks he's being called a bra, as in like the undergarment, which I thought was pretty good. He just has some, I think Jack Black, very inspired casting for this like slacker bully hybrid.
And we haven't talked much about Seth Green, the other kind of notable face that we see in this. I actually ran the Seth Green once. I don't want to do a repeat of what I did in Shark Boy and Lava Girl, but like I tried to this was when I was younger and stupider, and I tried to take a photo of him. And it's like, oh my fucking god, it's Seth Green. And like, so I try to do it, and then he walks by me. He's like, "Oh, that's so sneaky, bro."
That's actually very funny.
Quick on his feet.
He was, it's funny. I worked on set with him on a show I worked on a couple years ago called Con Man, and he might be the shordest.
Oh my
I've
god,
ever
yes.
Seen. Nicest guy in the world, but he's very short.
Where do I know you from?
He used to flush my head in the urinals.
Here we are on season 2 of Slimehouse, and we're still happily using Anchor. In case you're not familiar, Anchor is a free, easy-to-use, one-stop shop for hosting or editing a podcast, and it makes it easy to share on Spotify, Apple, and many more platforms across the World Wide Web. Download the free Anchor app, or go to anchor.fm to get started. And thanks for listening to our only paid sponsor.
Seth Green's character Wiley is Mitchell's cousin, and he lives with him while he's stuck in Cincinnati for 6 months. And this character has a dynamic with Mitchell that it's kind of like the cool kid, but with the lame friend dynamic, you could say. And this is especially played up in the scene where Mitchell is romancing Jack's sister. Then it turns into a double date where Wiley gets a date too, and she's very put off with him at first, but then they end up together, and I thought that was actually kind of cute. But like, I feel like the character of Wiley is like, he's very much kind of like into the stuff that was considered super extreme at the time. He's got posters of Kiss in his room. He's got like an Eraserhead poster that's holler, but and a Megadeth poster as well. Yeah. But I just like this is kind of like, I feel like this is a character you wouldn't really see as much in like movies today, like the kind of metalheadish guy. There's a really great scene where they try and get Wiley set up with his date, and Mitchell tries to get him with like a good costume to wear, and it's set to "I'm Too Sexy" by Right Said Fred, which was actually the #1 song on the Billboard charts when I was born, the day I was born.
Nice. So a personal connection to a pretty slimy banger, I'd say. I feel like this shows up as a gag in so many Slimehouse movies, and it was perfect in this. Like, I feel like that's pretty easy. The slimiest moment for me in this movie, just this very long montage. It's like the vast majority of the song of just Seth Green trying on these various ridiculous outfits. Just like he's dressed as a cowboy at one point. He's dressed as I don't know. He just goes through so many. It shows Mitchell reacting, and he just has these ridiculous. He's just laughing so hard. It's like you see the reaction, but it's never anything that noteworthy. It's just him like cracking up so much, which I thought was funny because it just seemed like the actors just like trying to make each other laugh, and I thought that was a funny scene. Wiley in general, his looks, both his costumes and his like everyday wear, was so like great early 90s like punk metalhead burnout type character to me. He has this like very straight hair, like cut off long hair. He has these red shades he's wearing when he's introduced. He wears a lot of like leather jackets and all this stuff. Just really a lot of great outfits from Seth Green here.
Yeah, it reminds me of a very specific kind of person that in the 90s was very prevalent. Probably post Wayne's World, was very big. Yeah, in a lot of ways he does embody a lot of key characteristics of the slimy sidekick that we've looked at. He's not particularly funny. He's not necessarily the comic relief, but he definitely has that kind of dopey sensibility to him that feels very prevalent in a lot of later movies that we've looked at.
Yeah, first off, I love the costumes in all of this. Riley gets this one moment where he has a bright red V-neck sweater with a t-shirt underneath it, and it's just like, and it's played as cool, whereas like nowadays that would have to be ironic. And then Mitchell has a lot of like oversized tees and everything's like bright blue, bright orange. I feel like I miss that's something I miss about the 90s was that everything was so bright, and that was really throughout it. And they go and they do a great job making the costumes that way. And one moment that Wiley gets that just feels very Slimehouse spirit is there's a moment where he is required to play hockey because they needed a fifth man on the team. And Mitchell's like, dude, you love hockey. Come on. And he's like, I like hockey on Nintendo. And then, of course, he's wearing like a ton of pads. He looks really silly, and he gets knocked off his feet on the ice, as one does when you don't know how to play hockey. But just that kind of can't quite get his stuff together, but endearing, goofy character is really great.
Yeah, they even put in like a little like cuckoo sound effect when he gets knocked out during the hockey game. It's like barely audible, but it's so bizarre. They put this like sound effect in there to just highlight like how hard he got knocked out. It's very funny to me.
That was a very funny little like cartoony ad that was very, very something that I feel like we would hear a lot in like later Slimehouse movies. But skating back to the hockey really quick, the hockey game itself, the first hockey game they play, I couldn't tell if it was like a underground hockey game or if it was an actual school sanctioned hockey game, because the arena looked kind of like a not a school
careful there, California kid.
Two, and their jerseys weren't really uniform. Like the colors weren't necessarily coordinated. There weren't any school logos. Maybe I totally misinterpreted that scene, but like I couldn't tell if it was like an underground hockey league or something.
Well, I think I feel like the biggest red flag to me is they're constantly talking about playing against the preps, which leads me to believe that like this is a hockey game between cliques, because like I don't know if the preps is another school, but like it seemed to me the whole time, like especially because this movie's anti-authoritarian kind of like or like cool attitude, I was leading me to believe like this is like the other kids versus the preppy kids in the school, because they were constantly talking about we got a big game against the preps and all this, which I definitely thought this was just like an underground. I didn't think it was school sanctioned for that reason, just because it seemed like cliques were at odds.
I will say that's a weakness of the film at times, is that it's, again, there's a whole slew of bullies. Some are kind of bully allies and some are just not at all. And I think this speaks to that of like, you kind of don't know what the stakes are. And at the end, they're like, oh, we have to face off against whoever it is, and it's unclear even who the other team is. Again, I was trying to identify some names, but there are a lot of anonymous bad guys, and it's not as clear what the stakes are. So that's one thing I think could have made the film even better, just regardless of, my enjoyment.
Yeah, because I feel like the last scene of this movie, the big race at Devil's Backbone, which definitely fits into that sort of neighborhood legend, local myth we've talked about with both the Ice Cream Man in Max Keeble and the Snowplow Man in Snow Day. And in that race, we sort of get these redemption arcs for like the majority of the bullies in the movie that are like pretty effective. Like at the end when Jack helps him win the big race, like it's a nice moment, but a lot of it doesn't really feel that earned because there just hasn't been like much of a stake set up for like these bullies other than just they're like bullies, but they're not the really bad bullies because like they are really mean to the dude and just don't really have a reason to be redeemed other than they just decide to be nice because he was really good at hockey.
And I think that goes back to kind of Nelson's apt comparison to Dazed and Confused, where this isn't a movie that necessarily has many like conflicts per se. It's just kind of like, here's a bunch of cool kids, the surfer bro Mitchell is cool, the hockey kids are kind of cool too, and they're just kind of trying to find their way, fight their way around the high school world. And to me, in that way, that kind of brings down the slime factor a little bit, because I talked about this a little bit with Snow Day actually, which is definitely a slimier movie, but kind of one plot of that movie is that character Hal kind of just trying to get a girl and kind of his trials and tribulations in getting the girl. And there's nothing particularly dramatic about any of the conflicts. It's all just kind of like excuses to show off some cool sports montages. And to me, I mean, that could be slimy in some regards, but to me it's not shot in a slimy way. It's shot in a very, as we said, kind of elegant, cinematic way, a lot of these sports scenes.
Yeah, so like the one scene that felt almost soapy to me is like when it's like at the diner when it's revealed that when Nikki and Jack are siblings, and then Jack also finds out then and there that she's dating Mitchell, and like that scene felt like it could have been tone setting for like the movie around it, but it just kind of felt like just that scene to me is like, you could argue it's a dramedy based off that scene, but you wouldn't have a very convincing argument otherwise.
That reminds me of one of my funnier observations in this movie, which is, again, to my point of like, this feels like a Macho Man movie, but toned down for its PG. Mitchell being like the cool dude mediator guy in that scene, when he's trying to like keep it cool in that scene, he goes, "Hey man, maybe we can just talk it over a basket of fries."
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that was. I think Mitchell, is such an interesting protagonist for this movie because there were times in the movie where I couldn't really figure out like, are we supposed to be like idolizing him and thinking he's like the coolest guy in the world, like some of the people in the movie do? Or are we supposed to think his like attitude that he's kind of like an airhead at times because he would say stuff sometimes that seemed like it was meant to be like read as funny, just the way he would say things, the way he would like just say funny things like chill brah all the time and just go really hard on this sort of surfer philosopher kind of thing. And so there's one scene in particular where he's asked 3 people he could have dinner with, and he says a professional surfer, I don't remember his name, Jack Curran I think was it, and then Gandhi, which just feels kind of pulled out of nowhere to show he's like a spiritual guy, and then the girl he's with at that moment. And he mentions Gandhi a few times in the movie, including like misquoting him saying something about water or surfing or something, which feels like something that definitely meant to be a joke to me. It's just, I feel like I couldn't really figure out, are we supposed to think he's the coolest guy in the world as viewers, or are we supposed to think he's like sympathetic and like him, but also like kind of funny in his, which didn't ring as very slimy to me, because I feel like in a lot of these Slimehouse movies, the main characters are sort of the audience, like you're supposed to very much, they're either like they have flaws, but they're usually not a joke in something. But in this, it kind of felt like he was a little bit at times of a joke, even if he's the protagonist.
Mitchell nowadays would be starting his own kombucha
company. Yeah.
I like how you phrase that, Max, because that kind of that style of character, that personality, kind of that wise weirdo kind of, I think, really kind of came to prominence a lot in the 90s and into the early thousands. A lot of the kind of main characters in the Happy Madison world, or I even think to a Goofy movie with the character who says the Leaning Tower of Cheese.
Yeah, and Pauly Shore voice and Pauly Shore in general,
Yeah.
I feel like very much exactly
totally.
that.
Even the movie Biodome, I think it's these like guys who come across as like goofballs and knuckleheads, but they're actually really smart and wise. They just kind of talk in a way that's a little, like they smoked too many bowls or caught too many waves. And so I think, to me, like, this character is kind of almost like an early version of that character trope that we'd see become really popular. And I think a lot of older movies for teens and kind of more like 20 somethings later in the decade and into the next decade.
Yeah, I feel like there's one scene that really like encapsulates the character to me pretty well, as he's giving a motivational speech to Wiley at one point, and he's like, who was a great man? Papa. Yeah. And he just like tells this sort of like inspirational yarn, and he's like, because he says, I am what I am, and teaches you to be yourself, and just gives this like speech about, which is like a pretty serious scene, but just ties it in with Popeye. He also has another weird scene where he tells this story that didn't really make much sense to me about like his origins, where he's talking about like, there was this major badass this one time, always fighting to get on the waves. It was just like a weird meandering story.
Yeah.
And yeah, he had these like serious moments that always just sort of like trailed off, or he would be using a weird subject that just I thought the character was very funny for that reason.
Yeah, he might be one of my favorite characters that we've covered on the show. It almost bordered on the line of like camp to me at some points, more than Slimehouse. His character's just so like kind of off the wall and totally not of the place that he's from, totally not of the location that the story is taking place in, that he's such a heightened character that it felt very campy to me.
Yeah, and that really lends to, I feel like this movie's like so early 90s, it feels like you couldn't even parody it by making it more early 90s. And I think that's a major like contribution to that. It's just his attitude, his dress, everything about him.
Another way it feels like that is maybe the score a bit. I don't think we've talked much about it. It feels very not Slime, but it's very, I like the score in this, but it doesn't really fit the mold of Slimehouse that we talk about. It doesn't have that kind of like a almost goofily kind of a normal sounding score that I think of when I think of a Slime movie score. It's very not John Debney.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is it's like the only score work I really knew from Stuart Copeland before this is the score for Rumblefish, which is like just sort of like a jazzy, like percussive score, and I wasn't expecting this to be anything like that score, but it actually is like a very percussion forward score in an interesting way. It has a lot, which makes sense. I mean, he is a drummer, like I said, but he's just, it's percussion forward, and there's just some interesting music, which is not what you expect, especially like the big race at the end, which you would expect the most just like boring sort of like royalty free sounding exciting chase music, and it's like stock music, but it's actually like a pretty interesting like percussion piece that Stuart Copeland, I guess, composed for it, that gives this movie a much more, even though of course the content isn't quite, makes this movie feel more like a more prestigious film than just what I was expecting, and from like a true, what I consider like super Slimehouse movie.
Yeah, and the guitar work, I think too, and Nelson brought this up, reminds me a lot of like a Top Gun or a Point Break. It has that very kind of like soaring guitar work that you'd hear in a lot of kind of 80s, 90s action movies.
And that music brings me to the climax of the movie, which also feels like something so 90s in a very positive way, where this was right at the peak of stunt work and that type of action that nowadays has a lot more safety component to it and doesn't try to do something super crazy. It also doesn't feel like it has to worry about saying like, do not try this at home kind of thing. And there's a movie I watched recently called Hot Dog the Movie, and it's a classic ski movie from the 80s. And the climax of that movie is, we're going to have a race to the bottom with no rules. And in this movie also, It's this huge race down the Devil's Backbone, which is a long strip of road that goes all the way through Cincinnati and similarly has no rules. And they really mean it in this one. The action is nuts.
Yeah, it's insane. A dude gets hit by a car.
Yeah.
A dude like flies off an edge through a fence, and like just some really intense. I was expecting it to just be like there'd be a sharp turn that's hard to miss or something, like hard not to follow. But like they go all the way through Cincinnati, like going through traffic, going under trucks, and yeah, like pretty like bonkers sequence that didn't see coming at all.
Seriously, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, just the camera moves really fast too during those scenes.
Yeah.
Like it just feels so kinetic.
Yeah, and there's like one gag in the whole thing, and it's when he like slides under some old men on a porch. One of the characters when he crashes, I think it's Jack Black's character maybe, and like everything else is pretty serious. Like most of those injuries would be severe, and they're treated as like they're not treated like he doesn't like get hit by the car and then like we show him and his eyes are like crossed and he looks woozy or something. Like for all we know, he's injured badly, and like the movie just treats the race with so much more gravity and all the injuries that occur in the stunts so much more seriously than I was expecting at all.
So, well, I don't have any stories. Don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Don't care. Just as long as I live near the beach and don't have to wear a tie. Then I'll be styling.
Let's skate into some slime scores here, y'all.
First, I just want to say, like, this was such a fun exercise. It's so different than what we do often because we had no real preconceived notions. So I really enjoyed the exercise of this movie, regardless of what I give a slime score. So kudos.
100%. Just echoing that, I think hopefully there's more goodies in store on the random slime generator that AKA our letterboxd watch list. But yeah, this was such a fun surprise of a movie and definitely just a blast of a movie, like no joke. It's a very fun movie.
I was never bored watching this. Not something I can say about every movie we've covered, but this is like just a beautifully imperfect kind of case study for Slimehouse. It's kind of almost like an ideal kind of first random pick.
Yeah, especially with like how in like a lot of like 90s nostalgia and like early Nickelodeon nostalgia is right now. I wish this movie was easier to see on streaming and had a better release and stuff, because I do think this is a movie that people would get a lot of fun out of, especially with appearances from like Seth Green in like a very, very early, like very 90s role. Jack Black, I think just his second role. I just feel like this movie should have a bigger cult than it has, because as far as I know, it doesn't really have one at all.
Yeah, I
had diamond in the rough.
I had to rent it on Fandango now.
Yeah, that's about. I had to get it on YouTube, which I never have rented a movie on
Same,
YouTube.
yeah. That was my first rented movie on YouTube.
Scarecrow Video up here in Seattle hooked me up with this movie. They have a copy of it, so kudos to them. I'll jump into my slime score first here, and
Okay.
I mean, I've already kind of beyond what I said about it just being like kind of a perfect first random kind of like case study for us. I do think like my slime score is going to be a 6 because I feel like it isn't trying to be a Slimehouse movie. It has a lot of things about it that are like adjacent to Slimehouse, I feel, and early Slime in particular. But I don't think they set out to make a Slimehouse movie, and it doesn't. I feel like that's reflected in my slime score.
Yeah, this one, it's sort of a hard one for me to rate because not only have we not really talked about many sports movies, I also didn't really watch many sports movies growing up. It's not really a genre I had much familiarity or fondness with. I was never saw the Mighty Ducks until much later, never saw Sandlot until much later, so I don't have that much of a comparison point, but my gut, I'd have to give it a 5 for similar reasons to Jared said. This movie doesn't really feel like it's a Slimehouse movie. It feels like something sort of separate. I'm not quite sure what, but it just doesn't feel slimy to me. It feels like more of its own just extreme sports movies sort of thing as a genre. I think that a lot of stuff in it is sort of slimy tropes. I think that the aunt and uncle character are very slimy. I think the fish out of water is slimy, and the bullies, especially with their insults, are pretty slimy. But overall, the movie just kind of stands alone to me, and I'd have to give it a 5 because it's just kind of right down the middle for me.
I'm actually going to go a little different direction on this. This is our first sports movie, and I feel like those movies were so important, not because I necessarily liked them, but because they were often on Nickelodeon or the Disney Channel. It kind of reminded me of like Alley Cat Strike or something, where it just takes its given sport quite seriously. And to me, I feel like that's enough of a pie slice in the Slimehouse wheel that I'm willing to go a little higher because I think it has enough of that energy of like extreme attitude, and I agree that it's not as kiddie as some of our other ones, but the fact that it's so much a PG movie and that does feel like something that in middle school I would want to watch going on high school if I were a middle schooler circa 1993. So for all those reasons, I'm going to go with an 8 actually, just cuz it has a lot of that, even though it's not anywhere, not going to hit that higher note, but it has enough of that spirit and attitude and aesthetic for me to go a higher number.
Echoing everyone, this was definitely a tough one for me to pin a score on. A movie that it reminded me of in kind of the current context, which I'm not sure any of you guys watched for our 2020 Slime review, is a movie called Go.
Yes.
Yeah, I watched that one.
Which is on Netflix now. And basically it's about a kid who moves to a small town in Australia. It's an Australian movie about a kid who moves to a small town and gets really into go-karting. And it's very similar kind of narrative structure to this, but Go has zero sense of humor. And if it does, it's pretty kind of basic. It's not crude, it's not gross. It's not slimy by any means, even though the narrative is ripe for a Slimehouse treatment. Airborne also lacks a sense of humor that is crude and kind of gross that we talk about, but I think its attitude of extremes is very important and very key and very formative for a lot of what we'd see in the genre to come. I also think the idea of freedom and individualism that is portrayed in this movie is really key to the Slimehouse ethos. That said, I really like your point, Jared, that it doesn't feel like they were setting out to make a Slimehouse movie by any means. Like this is a movie that takes what it's doing very seriously. And for that, I'm going to give it a 6. It's Slimehouse in a very unchiseled form, and it's doing a lot of things that would become more specified later in the genre. Even though if you watch it, you're like, oh, this has the attitude and the aesthetics of a Slimehouse movie. It lacks that key sense of humor and anarchy that I think really defines that Slime.
Even though my score is higher, I agree with a lot of that sentiment, and I think that kind of our sum average really hits where this movie fits. I think I just felt more affinity and gave it a higher score because of that sort of fertile, where it's going energy. But I think overall that's really solid place for this movie to land, and I hope people seek it out, because if you're into Slimehouse, this is definitely a good uncharted discovery.
Yeah, for sure. I think this was the perfect one, like we've said before, to land on for our first Slime Shuffle, just because it's such a movie that was just kind of not on our radar, and also just it planted some very interesting seeds for Slimehouse, even if I didn't find it particularly slimy. Definitely an important movie, to me at least, in the Slimehouse realm.
Well, Max, thank you for rolling the dice so well. The 737 sided dice.
So that's Airborne. Everyone go check it out. And as the tagline says, man wasn't meant to fly, kids were. So everyone, stay slimy.
Slimehouse, a podcast created by Jared Anderson, Jasper Birnbaum, Max Morris, and H. Nelson Tracy. If you like this episode, you can find more fun on slimehousepod.com. Our website is created by Brian Hume of Valencia Creative Company. Our theme music composed by Greta Russell. Support this podcast at anchor.fm/slimehousepod or by following us on social media at slimehousepod on all platforms.